Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of today's many sessions. My name is Alexis Wick. I teach in the Department of History and Archaeology here at AUB, and I'm really delighted to be here and to join you for this wonderful conference. The session today is called Knowledge and 19th Century Empires, and it's really a pleasure to introduce my very valued colleague, Professor Richard Smith, who has profoundly impacted many of us here at AUB, certainly me. And he is now retired professor in civilization studies and anthropology at AUB, but I'm delighted to see that he will continue to contribute and participate in the intellectual and social life of Ras Beirut and AUB in particular. He needs little introduction. His works include a foundational article and book, Rule by Records, Land Registration and Village Custom in Early British Punjab, and more recently, along with Martha Mundy, the co-authored Governing Property, Making the Modern State, Law, Administration, and Production in Ottoman Syria. Please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Smith.
Hello, good morning. The terms measures and categories in the title of the conference suggest a relation to the production of statistical knowledge. And this in turn implies some kind of relation to the production of knowledge for or by the state, at least in the original sense of statistics, which is, as Professor Iragon said yesterday, relates to everything that a statesman or legislator needs to know. So what I propose to do here is to discuss the role of statistics in the production of knowledge about rural transformation under British imperial rule in India, as one model or example of the relation between knowledge production and the state that may, and I hope will, be contrasted with another model or example found in Imperial Ottoman rule of Arab lands from the middle of the 19th to the early 20th centuries. The model concerns the production of official knowledge about Indian systems of land tenure and agriculture through an administrative operation called settlement, or more fully, land revenue settlements. The settlement of how much landholders would pay the government to enjoy their land under conditions specified in law. This was an operation of extreme importance to the British in India, firstly because some 80% of revenue came from the land, and secondly, and rather particularly, because forming a tiny foreign elite, British officials thought they should devise a system of rule that, to an extent they would determine, ran as much as possible along indigenous lines. It was thus essential for the ruling elite to get to know agricultural systems and more generally Indian culture, especially law. For, as officials often said, the efficiency of their rule depended upon the accuracy of their information. Settlement thus became an operation that had significant influence on the formation of the sociology of India. or at least the formation of a proto-sociology of India characterized by certain key concepts, such as, in the early days, the Indian village community as constitutionally a village republic, and later by the overriding concept of caste. A huge amount has been written about this, so I propose to only limit myself to a couple of critical points. The time period I'm talking about is for India, the mid-19th century, which was formative, and for the Ottoman rule slightly later. So the first point is the term statistic. The German Statistik, with a K, had been adopted by Sir John Sinclair in his statistical account of Scotland in 1791 to 98. And it was probably on this model that an official position of statistical reporter was created in the Bombay government in the 1810s, whose first incumbent died in 1822. That person's successor, W.H. Sykes, then a captain, but in the East India Company's civil service, devoted his attention more to what we would now call statistical matters, especially in directing censuses in two localities of central India, 1827-1826, in which he compared rates of mortality with cities in Europe. By directing his own censuses, Sykes was perhaps encroaching on the role of two major official operations already working in the 1820s, those of geographical surveys, for one, and settlement operations for the other, land revenue settlements, especially the latter, whose purpose was to assess the productive resources of land, which usually included censuses both of animals and of human populations, before settling the land revenue to be collected from landholders. Sykes left his job in 1831, and on his return to England became a leading figure in the promulgation of statistics through the Statistical Society of London, formed in 1834, of which he was a founding member, and through the Journal of the Statistical Society of London, the first number of which was published in 1838, and which is still running as the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society. It needs to be remembered that the term sociology had not yet been coined. Much of the content of the early numbers of the Journal of the Statistical Society of London can be considered descriptive sociology, typically presented in numerical or tabular form. Sykes was to write some 39 articles for the journal between 1838 and 1867, of which 24 concerned India. In 1840, he was elected a member of the board of directors of the East India Company, and it may be partly through his influence that the board directed the establishment of a statistical department in the government of India in 1846. This period of 1840s is, as Professor Ireton said yesterday, it was terrifically important for the formation of censuses. The censuses were being discussed in Europe, and so the board of the East India Company, it actually didn't, I better not get into this, it didn't actually order the form of censuses. We can discuss this a little bit. So anyway, it's from this period, the 1840s, that series like the Statistical Abstracts of British India date. So now, this first point concerns both what statistics in the mid-19th century entailed and how statistics was central to the British administration of India almost from its inception. The mathematical sense of statistics in the form of distribution of large numbers, measurements of significance in correlating variables and so on, hardly came into the pages of the Journal of the Statistical Society of London until the 1880s. Regarding the importance of statistics to the British administration of India, I want to mention here a further impetus to the compilation of statistics at the village level that were then abstracted at a higher level of administration. This was the Famine Commission of 1880, following two disastrous famines in the 1870s, whose report directed that revenue officials in villages prepare and keep up to date statistical abstracts of population, livestock, area cultivated under different crops, and so on. For the Punjab, these were called Lal Kitabs, literally red books, or village account books. And they were compiled from the late 1880s for the levels of village, tahsil, and district. Regarding their accuracy, doubt has sometimes been expressed. But that's another matter, more broadly related to the way the basic records of rights to land in a village called Jamabandi had to be brought up to date every 4 years by the village accountant or patwari, and to the ways that an intrusive and over-determining system of land registration suffocated under its own weight, something that also apparently happened to German Statistik. I take up now the question of the level at which statistical abstracts were prepared. Two things have to be borne in mind regarding British India: scale and language. The language of the official ruling elite was English, and the unit above which only English operated in government was the district. Within district administration, another of the many languages of India operated, depending on region, not only in the compilation of records, but in court proceedings and so on. But a district typically comprised 1,000 villages. There is thus an epistemological problem. What could be said from an independent point of view of the district might differ substantially from what was abstracted from the level of the village compilations, including village records. District reports, a dominant genre in the archive of British India, created their own discursive reality. Moreover, when it comes to abstraction, even a category like wheat might, when presented at the district level, but even more at the higher level of all India, might amalgamate different local senses of the term, let alone a category like caste. At the first really synchronous census of India in 1881, the 8,000 caste categories for the Punjab, which were found at the slightly higher level of division, had to be brought down to 333. And it was those 333 that were actually used to determine the enumeration, classification, and enumeration of future censuses. So what you have is the top determining the bottom. as a Padre said, people were unyoked from local systems of caste classification and drawn upwards to a new game of numbers and names. I want now to go back to the earlier period of 1830 and 1840s to pick up the point of an epistemological gap between what can be said from the perspective of a district and what can be said from the perspective of a village, or what may be abstracted about a district from village-level entries. Settlement operations involve the preparation of village records in which both the cultivator and the owner of every distinct plot of land within the village boundaries were registered, whether the plot was held singly or jointly, whether the plot was in fact cultivated or not. The village records also included what was effectively the village's constitution, drawn up in the form of a contract between the landowners and the government, spelling out how the village was to govern itself. This for every village in the Punjab, some 55,000 in 1881. Bentham's panomium, as opposed to panopticon, gone wild. If you're not familiar with the term panomion, panomion is Bentham's term for a complete body of law, settling everything in law, according to the utilitarian principle. Now, the village records, I'm talking about the epistemological gap, right, between village records and district reports. The village records were legally binding, carrying the presumption of truth. Individuals were thus bound into a local rule by records that, however closely reflecting the way people actually interacted on the ground, nevertheless drew people into a new process of attestation and accountability within the British Indian judicial system. At the same time, however, the settlement officer who was responsible for settlement operations in the whole district had to write an official report in English. From 1844, these settlement reports were published. And it was these district settlement reports which became the basis of official knowledge about districts and hence about India, feeding into other genres also published at the district level, such as gazetteers, as well as feeding into European scholarship, for instance, in Henry Maine's Village Communities East and West of 1871. I've called this process of disseminating information within the ruling elite of British India and more generally to the bourgeois English-reading public, rule by records, a process which complemented the rule by reports, a process which complemented the village-level rule by records. I've long considered land registration and census enumeration in British India technology of rule, in Foucault's sense. But at the higher level, would the rule by reports be considered a technology of rule? Here I think it's correct to go back to Edward Said's seminal understanding of the way that a discourse determines how people come to be seen and see themselves. Writing reports not only requires a different kind of skill than recording statistical facts, a skill of organizing, selecting, managing, summarizing, and condensing, but it creates a moral sense of authority. In the Indian context, a moral sense not only of knowing the country, but of knowing what was good for it. Schloetzer, in his Theorie der Statistik of 1804 and earlier, wrote of a statistical gaze, der statistische Blick, which involved a pre-perceptual understanding or grid through which, as one scholar describes it, quotes, the external world could be appropriated as a reality by the social scientist. It generated a self-consciously enlightened, according to Schlözer, understanding. I've not done the work to relate such an understanding to that of someone like, say, Bentham, for the purpose of this article, but I mention it here as being of some comparative interest. The other point of comparison is with procedures of registration in the Ottoman Empire. Depending on the region, land records were prepared at the level of village from the 1860s, whether of tapu, property right, nüfus, civil registration or census, or verdi, tax. I'm not talking here of the temettüat, or income registers, prepared between 1840 and 1845 only for Turkish central lands, of which Hürriyet is İslamoğlu and her former student Alp Kaya have written. But tapu, nüfus, and vergi records no doubt drew villagers into land registries and Shari and Nizami courts in new ways for purposes of attestation, accountability, dispute, and alienation. By comparison with British India, however, I wouldn't call this a rule by records, since apart from anything else, the records were not exhaustive, uncultivated land was not registered, no field maps were prepared, but also because the process was less invasive and the administrative backup was meager. Nor is it clear in what sense there was a kind of rule by reports, whether as narrative reports like the published settlement reports I spoke about for India, or as statistical abstracts for administrative units higher than the village, apart from population abstracts, which were prepared apparently from the beginning of the 20th century, at least for the central lands of what is now Turkey. Although I haven't seen them, I haven't worked them, so I don't have any personal experience on them. There thus seems to have been little grounding for an embryonic sociology of Arab lands during the period of Ottoman rule, and little discourse seems to have been generated amongst the bourgeois public about the Arab population. Salim Dedinjel, writing particularly of Libya and Yemen in relation to Bedouins, but drawing on Osama Muqtazi for Lebanon, uses the term borrowed colonialism for late Ottoman governance, whereas Hürriyet İslamoğlu, writing of the Ottoman state's failure to produce cadastral maps and citing James Scott's Seeing like a State, takes a different line, quotes, "In the case of the non-colonial Ottoman period, Ottoman state, its ability to be an outsider, that is, to abstract itself from the context of power relations within the empire, was far more limited. Perhaps the terms I've used for analyzing the production of statistical knowledge and the grounding of sociology in the northwest of British India are simply not appropriate to the Ottoman Empire." Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for a truly insightful paper. We've decided to take questions at the end of the session